wanted to welcome you all to our conversations on Europe. The University of Pittsburgh EU Center of Excellence began the Conversations on Europe series in 2012. So now we're in our second decade, and I'm delighted to be leading the series. My name is Randell Halle. I'm the director of the European Studies Center, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Pittsburgh. We have a rich archive of previous conversations on varied topics, and those you can find at our website. Next month, however, looking forward, on October 17th, we will be convening to have a discussion on the Polish elections of great significance, not just for Poland, but certainly for the future of Europe. The following month, November 14th, I will be teaming up with my colleagues at our Center for African Studies to discuss the 60th anniversary of the Yaoundé Convention, a trade agreement that not many know about, but set the relations in place with decolonizing African states that continue on to the present, and it gives us an opportunity to reflect on Africa and EU relations now. Today, however, we are here to discuss the future of labor and labor security in the EU. The EU declared 2023 the year of skills, and we have one of the people directly behind that, and we're going to be talking with him in a moment, to bring attention to the challenges of the contemporary workforce that it faces and to the EU responses. It's indeed a period of transition in labor, with no little unrest. The Yellow Vest strikes are perhaps globally the best known of the strikes that have taken place recently in Europe, but if anybody was traveling this summer, it was probably a summer of travel disruptions. And this conversation on Europe considers indeed then the state of labor and the security of employment. This is a webinar. You will have the opportunity to ask questions. I'm speaking to our audience at this point. Feel free to post questions at any time during the discussion. We recommend that you use the question and answer rather than the chat, although I have both open. We will try to get as many of your questions as we can. Today's conversation is presented by the European Studies Center, which is part of the University Center of International Studies at Pitt. It's co-funded by the Erasmus program of the European Union, and our co-sponsors are Georgia Tech, Miami, Florida, and the European Union Center of Excellence at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Florida, and the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. You're certainly welcome to look more at our website for all the events that we're organizing. But finally, before we begin the conversation, I want to thank Pavel Levitsky and Ingrid Gomez-O'Toole for their help with organizing, contacting, and bringing everybody here together for today's conversation. So we'll begin. I will go first by introducing and then initiating a conversation with each of our panelists. We'll go in a kind of cycle here, and then we'll open it up to a general conversation. I'd like to begin with introducing to you Stefan Olsson, who is the Deputy Director General, a very high-ranking position and the European Commission for the DG Employment, Social Affairs, and Inclusion, DG Employ. Stefan Olsson, if there is unfortunately a kind of image of the faceless bureaucrat in the EU, Stefan is exactly the person you want to remedy that. He is a person who has a long career within the Commission and who has been engaged with all sorts of initiatives outside the Commission, tending to things as varied and tending to things that are varied and engaging in many, many important considerations, including dealing with carcinogens and dealing with various kinds of crises in the EU. He's a Swedish lawyer with degrees in international tax law. He joined the European Commission in 1996. So has a long career within the Commission. He's been working with DG Employ since 2000. In 2015, he took up the position of director in DG Employ under the Juncker Commission at the time. And with that, maybe, Stefan, we can turn to your current work. And it is an American audience, but it is probably an audience of people who are somewhat familiar with the EU. But the Commission can be kind of mystifying at times. And so maybe a few words about DG Employ, one of the 33 Directorate Generals in the Commission. But we really want to talk about the Year of Skills, and congratulations on the massive project. So you might, now we're more than halfway through, perhaps you could also tell us about the year, what motivated it, and what some of the projects are, some of the thousands that are being organized. You can't have favorites, I know, but maybe you could describe some of that, and maybe some of the long-term outcomes you hope to see. So a few minutes in all of those questions you could help address.
Thank you very much, Randell, and thank you very much for having me. It's quite a tall order to try to wrap that up and in a few minutes, but first, well, I mean, DG employment. Yeah, it's quite simple. I think we're the administration that sees to it that the commitments made at EU level in the area of employment and social affairs are carried through. And that, if I would, I miss a few things, obviously, but we have a big fund that sponsors member states' initiatives on, let's say, training, but also issues like inclusion, fighting discrimination, etc. So that's a big part. Then we have a number of EU-initiated labor laws, and then we have mobility, and then, of course, the issue that we're discussing more today, the skills. And so we have around 800 people where we have a commissioner, a very competent ex-employment minister from Luxembourg, who now is the Commissioner for Employment, Nicolas Schmidt, who knows all about this, and he then works, in a collegial form under President von der Leyen, of course. So skills and the European Year of Skills. Yeah, I mean, European years are usually a year will have a certain theme, and it's declared a European year. It is actually negotiated by our legislators, the Parliament and the Council of Ministers. So it's quite a serious initiative, and there's a lot of thought going into what will be a year. It can be an issue that hasn't been discussed that much at EU level. I did one when I was a team leader on discrimination many years ago, that then later led to legal proposals on anti-discrimination. This year, our president herself took the initiative, having spoken to a lot of stakeholders, to business. And she felt that while we're doing a lot on skills, mainly the member states' competence, but we try to support from the EU, over 70% of employers in Europe were still saying that they couldn't find the skilled workers they needed, and that they felt that this would be the main barrier to growth, to productivity, and that it could even lead to having to close down. That was really, I think, why our president announced that she wanted this year herself to be the Year of Skills, and the European Parliament and the Council picked up on that. That means, I mean, we had a lot of activities going on already, a lot of big partnerships like the Pact for Skills, where we have over 1,500 businesses of different sizes who together have taken commitments on training more than 10 million workers. We have a number of academies on these a lot of bottleneck industries. These are not academies, it's not the European Commission that is doing the training or sponsoring training, but we're bringing together different actors and supporting their cooperation in order, like on solar, on batteries, on cybersecurity, and trying to increase the number of opportunities there. So the year basically has become, this year on skills is bringing up these initiatives, making them known, discussing how we can improve them, how we can get more actors in. We also have a international strand of it, and I think what I spend the most time on is a very interesting cooperation in the context of the Trade and Technology Council, the cooperation between the EU and the US, where we work closely with a number of stakeholders, big companies, US companies and EU companies and stakeholders. It's the Chamber of Commerce and my Director General who's cooperating on this, where we try to also work together with the US to look at the issues and what can we learn from each other. And I think overall, and I'll stop there to give more place for the debate, but I think what we see is that we have still a very strong focus on formal education, diplomas, while businesses are increasingly looking for a kind of a skills first. That you know, with the with the very low, historically low unemployment we have, companies are looking to bring people in. Doesn't have to be people with the exact right training, and then training them in different forms on the job. But there needs to be models for that. There needs to be the right tools. There needs to be a lot of support on that. And I think this is really the shift in narrative that we're looking for, to not get too stuck into formal qualifications, but to have a more dynamic, a more market adapted approach to skills. And that's what we're discussing during the year, what we're promoting during the year, which we will hope will also be strengthened during the year. So I'll stop there, Randell, and hand back to you. Thanks.
That's very helpful, and certainly I'll turn to Jane in a second, but I think that one of the interesting dynamics here is the different way of credentialing that takes place in the different states, and it's not just a question of skills versus diplomas, but rather entire systems that are in place. I know in Germany and the Netherlands, the kind of apprentice systems that are there are really a large part of education and other concerns. So we'll come back to that. I look forward to expanding on that question. But let's turn to my colleague, Jane Gingrich, who's at the University of Oxford. She is a professor there of comparative social policy. Received her PhD from UC Berkeley, but we verified that she is from the further north in Canada originally. And what I'm excited about having Jane as a participant in the conversation here is that she's really worked for quite a bit on a sort of what I would describe as the intersection of social policy and market, and has been exploring, in effect, how social policy may or may not actually work well with market transformations. And so labor, the workplace, the conditions and forms of production are constantly changing, and it's really not since Keynes and the formation of the modern state. We can think of Machiavelli and the Prince, but the idea of the state being a kind of directive force in the marketplace is central to the way we think of things here. And really, it's an issue for the state if it gets it right, that's good. If it gets it wrong, that's not good, you know. And in considering, just as I was alluding to Stefan just a second ago, Europe and the EU in particular are a further complexity of the national and the transnational here. So just one last thing is that Jane is currently working on a European Research Council funded project on post-war education and policy reform in advanced industrial democracies. So she's looking at the changes that are largely going to have been and will probably be impacting the academic communities into the future. And we're looking forward to hearing of the results, and maybe that'll be a future conversation on Europe. But Jane, I'm wondering, if you could help us understand then a little bit of the longer history here and what your analysis would be to help us understand what might be the better moments in policy and market transformations as they've been intersecting with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting moment, and sort of to take your question slightly out of order, if you think about sort of what the sort of one of the hottest economic questions of the moment, or social policy questions even of the moment, is actually coming out of the US, where we're looking at the rise of industrial policy, or at least the forefronting of industrial policy, and the question of what role states can really play in transforming market structures in a more directed way. And certainly the experience of the sort of chips and IRA in the US have initiated a lot of debate in Europe about sort of where some of those potential sort of forms of investment, which aren't really about skills, but about other forms of economic investment, can occur. And I think that this idea of kind of a revitalized state role in the economy that extends beyond sort of market conforming policies pushes back a little bit against the way sort of things have been moving over the last 2 decades, particularly in European labor markets broadly defined. And so one of the things that you raised, but also in the sort of broader theme of this, is sort of how do we think about some of these transformations in the contemporary European labor markets, and the sort of the role of the state in structuring some of those. And clearly the last few years we've seen a rise of labor unrest, as you pointed to in the beginning, and also sort of policy initiatives built around that. And I think we sort of need to put that, probably, as you asked, in the sort of broader historical context of the last 2 decades. And so if we kind of work backwards from the COVID moment, in many ways, what COVID revealed, in part, when it comes to sort of the broader structure of many European systems of social policy, and I'll leave education for a moment, I'll come back to it, is that, in fact, they were relatively effective. And so you had, maybe as opposed to the response to the financial crisis, you had relatively rapid action that was largely kind of labor preserving, skill preserving in the European context as we sort of went into the initial lockdown phase. But coming out of it, the sort of cost of living crisis that has hit everywhere, hit workers, and it built on what had been really 2 decades of cutbacks and reforms in aspects of that safety net and the way in which workers were protected. And so for public sector workers, the decade leading up to COVID was really one of like quite restricted wages. And in the private sector, the last 2 decades, we've seen a lot of deregulation in temporary worker contracts, not so much in full-time worker contracts. And this has led to bifurcation in parts of the European labor market, and different kinds of demands that are coming out of that. So as we sort of put that in, I think the sort of broader context of sort of an erosion of aspects of state responsibility, but also ongoing areas in which the European welfare state and safety net look very distinct to the US, much more robust, more direct labor regulations. The question of sort of how to kind of jumpstart that and revitalize that in a way that becomes sustainable going forward and addresses new areas of worker concerns has really, I think, been at the top of the agenda. When it comes to education, the challenge within this mix is that employers always, well, not always, but employers very often complain that they're not getting the skills that they want in the labor market, but are not always equally willing to invest in training. And I think it's really promising to hear about the initiatives that are happening in that regard. And the question of sort of how states can sort of build together and bring groups of actors together to really invest in ways in which we can see sort of nimble training systems emerge, in which the needs of sort of right now can be provided either in the firm or in schools or in other kinds of vocational training institutes, is a sort of a perennial problem in the study of education. But I think it's taken on a particularly urgent form in more recent years, where we've seen the skill shortages coming out of the pandemic, but we are also seeing fairly rapid changes in the nature of work due to technology and other forms of automation. And we see the emergence of a fairly low-paid, lower productivity service sector in which underinvestment in many of these workers really limits the possibility for these workers to get a good job or a job that's sort of sustainable in the long run. So all of these trends have come together, and I think the question really is sort of what kind of strategic policies are on offer to address them, but also where the political coalitions behind that lie.
That's quite a bit. Thank you. But I wonder, just to immediately push a little bit, do you have any sense of, so we can talk about the European level as such, but we can also talk about the various member states, or we can talk about Europe that goes beyond the EU and include indeed the UK. But I'm wondering if you might have some indications of where what you described is not necessarily across the board. So might there be a place that's getting that where social policy is getting better, or labor policy is getting it better, or getting it worse? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to skills and the intersection with the welfare state, there's traditionally has been a kind of north-south divide, at least in the older EU member states, and the story I think looks a little different in the more recent member states. But in terms of skills, the kind of classic story that you have relatively well-developed vocational education and training systems that are still relatively collaborative with manufacturing and other forms of industry in Northern Europe, and that these create forms of competitive, export-oriented, high-skilled industries is broadly still true. But the concerns in those economies I think are twofold. The first is, there's this lingering concern about sort of global competition, particularly we're looking at things like electric vehicles being produced in China. There's a lot of questions about sort of what that's going to do to the German auto manufacturing industry and what that then means for some of these systems of vocational training built around that. But secondly, in these training systems, there's many workers, especially in the service sector, that don't benefit necessarily from them, and where you've seen like much more stagnant wages over the last 2 decades. And these are often, disproportionately women and ethnic minorities in parts of these sectors, and they're less well served by them. So in Northern Europe, those have been, I think, on the agenda really for the last 2 decades as questions. In parts of Southern Europe, there's also these so-called insider-outsider problems where you have quite protected workers and then you have a large temporary workforce. And there, the systems of vocational training have traditionally been less developed, and it's been more difficult to encourage young people to go into vocational training in some cases than it is to follow more of a university-oriented path or exit training entirely. And there, the question of sort of how to upgrade aspects of those systems and provide people with a route to a more stable, high-quality jobs have been really long-standing and have been hit in different ways, I think, by the pandemic, where you had, questions about the sustainability of tourism sectors or other service-oriented sectors that also with climate change are going to, really require some rethinking about how to operate. And there are questions about both the income security for people after a decade of austerity in particular, but also the education and training systems in which probably sort of German-style vocational training is not really on the agenda, become really central. So sorry, I hope that wasn't too long of an answer.
That is not too long of an answer, but it's certainly a fulsome answer that leads us into all sorts of questions. Actually, I forgot, I have a link here that I'm putting in the chat to the Year of Skills. So if any of you want to actually see what is going on and maybe find something, if you're on the European side, or maybe apparently on the American side, you can actually find an event or an activity that's near you. But you raised a number of issues that actually, Jane, you raised a number of issues that actually lead us very easily to turn to Jamie at this point. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Jamie Woodcock, who's a researcher based in London, a senior lecturer at the University of Essex, and an author of numerous books that hopefully you can find easily on a bookshelf, a bookstore near you, if bookstores are still a thing. And I won't ask, we could ask Jamie what he thinks about Amazon and that kind of marketplace, because precisely much of what Jamie has been doing is paying very much attention to the digital turn and post digital turn, and a recent project is on the platform economy, and which has received much critical praise. And I really think that this question that Jane was raising about the impact on labor transformations of, say, the gig economy, what that's meant is something that's really what you've been focused on in a very active way. And you yourself are very active a supporter of unions and can help us think quite a bit about labor here. And as I observed earlier, when we don't get this intersection between market and policy right, and even sometimes when we do, there's a lot of disruption, and behind that, labor unrest that emerges can also be a sign of a lot of individual anxiety, suffering, and displacement. So, Jimmy, in your work, one of the things that I've noticed and appreciated is that you've been helping draw attention to the trends in workforce, actually from a kind of bottom-up perspective, and thinking about what it means to be a laborer in the current economy. And you have some investment in an idea of workerism that in your discussion of platform economies, say Uber and Deliveroo and Lieferando, you really sort of already began formulating responses to artificial intelligence to take us into maybe the next mode of disruption. And I will just say that maybe Jane and Stefan will particularly be interested, but I find probably the artificial intelligence question is going to get attention in different ways, because it's going to be impacting, say, middle class or the academic, the intelligentsia, in new ways that that might make us obsolete, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder if you could help us then understand a little bit more this wave of labor unrest that we have really across Europe. And as I mentioned before, although the UK is outside of the EU, I would certainly include it as a place of interest in our conversation on Europe. So, Jamie, if you have a few thoughts here, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have quite a few thoughts. And I really want to say two things. The first is about Europe, but of course, any Europeans on the panel or Europeans listening will of course know that this no longer comes from somebody inside the European Union. So you can take that with a pinch of salt. But then I also want to speak a bit about transformation of work, and to talk a bit about the gig economy or platform work. And I think the first thing to say is to talk about Europe is quite, from a labor perspective, can be quite a challenging thing to talk about labor across the European continent, in part because not all countries are members of the European Union across the continent. And then many of those countries have quite different labor regulations and labor laws, quite different histories of trade unions, histories of dynamics like co-determination, so having worker representatives and worker councils of various kinds inside of organizations. And so there's a very kind of diverse picture when we talk about what's happening with labor, what's happening with labor security. And my controversial opinion for the discussion here is that my understanding of the European project is a twofold project. One is a project of Europeanness, of countries and people within those countries identifying with each other as part of a shared project or a shared vision. And then the other is of the European project as a deeply neoliberal project, as a project about trying to reorganize institutions, regulations, and patterns of policy making in order to secure a settlement that benefits, on the one hand, increasingly benefits capital over labor, and on the other hand, increasingly benefits the core of Europe vis-a-vis the periphery of Europe. So particularly benefiting, for example, Germany vis-a-vis Southern European countries. And so there's always a bit of a contradiction when we talk about Europe, because Europe means different things to different people. And I think there has been a push, and in part, I think Jane was talking towards this. The last 2 decades have seen a push towards increased flexibilization through policies in the European Union, of increased precaritization of work, of undermining of some of the better conditions in Europe, and an opening up of labor markets. And I think one of the things that we need to think about when we think about this is the reliance of migrant work, or migrant workers more specifically, in many European countries. And so a large part of my research is with migrant workers, many of whom entered through Europe, and went through patterns of migration in which many people are losing their lives in the Mediterranean as a direct result of European policies around stopping the flow of migration. And so I think it's important to remember, when we talk about policies, many of these have very, very concrete effects on people's lives. Mm-hmm. And in part, I think, Randell, this is what you were mentioning in the introduction, is what I try to do in my research is to bring to life the experiences of people who are doing work that's going through transitions of various kinds, to try and tell stories about people's experience of, it's easy to talk about flexible work or precarious work. It's a different thing to have those sorts of experiences. And I think platform work, or the gig economy, however we want to try and capture this phenomenon. And when I talk about this, I'm predominantly talking about transport workers. Mm-hmm. And in Britain, this is predominantly taxi transportation and food delivery, and to some extent parcel delivery, which is being mediated through online platforms, so through smartphone apps. And I want to tell a very small story, if I have enough time, about first how I ended up doing this research, because this research is now very fashionable, and I'm somewhat embarrassed to have to say, I was doing it before it was fashionable. This is what all hipsters say, right? I wasn't a hipster. I was listening to that band way before. But I think there's an interesting reason why I ended up doing this, which is I had a student who was doing this work. And he came to me after class and he said, look, I don't understand how this work fits into what we're talking about. I've never met anybody who works at the company. I get my orders through a smartphone. I don't have any social protections through this work. I want to try and understand it a bit more. And we wrote a paper about Deliveroo together to try and make sense of it. And through meeting him, I met lots of other delivery riders in London, and it's been almost, coming on 10 years of doing research with platform workers. But I wanted to say, one story, one interview that I did with a worker, which has always stuck with me, about what they thought the biggest challenges of this kind of precarious work was. And he'd worked many jobs before. He'd worked in cafes, in hospitality, and he'd worked in a bookshop. There are still bookshops where you can go and buy books. We appreciate them, yes. And we should appreciate them, otherwise they will disappear. But he started working for Deliveroo, and he said he really appreciated being able to pick his own time to work. This is a classic story that comes out of this kind of work, that people are rejecting formal employment because it is lacking in flexibility. It can't fit around people's lives in ways that they want it to. And so they're looking for other ways to make a living in more flexible ways. And I asked him at one point, what's the most difficult part of your job? And I thought he'd say, it's not having a contract, or not having union recognition, or whatever, a whole range of these things we might expect from the literature. And he said, the biggest problem I have is I wake up in the morning, I don't like eating breakfast. I go to my first job, I have to eat lunch. I eat lunch in a rush because I have to go and work for Deliveroo. I then work another job in the afternoon, and then I go and ride for Deliveroo in the evening. And the biggest challenge I have is when I get home at night, eating enough calories to be able to go out and repeat the process the next day. And I think in that there is a kind of damning indictment of this kind of work, that although the advertising tells us, it's young people ordering avocado on toast or sushi and enjoying the kind of high life of delivery food, mainly these services are used by people who are too overworked to cook their own dinner, and they get home late from work and order their own food. People get taxi transportation because they're working late, because they want to try and fit more things into their life. And people are being overworked doing many of these kinds of jobs in order for everybody else to spend so much time working. And I think that's a kind of, it's an indictment of the kinds of work that have come to replace the employment that was lost in 2008. That this kind of work is making up for, many of the older forms of work that were lost during the previous financial crisis. And the other thing that I just want to say before I finish on this is, I think there's now a generation of young workers who have entered into employment after the financial crisis. And even when you talk to them about financial crises, they say, which one? We've been through a whole number in our lifetime. Have had negative experiences of education often, in the UK might not have gone through the COVID process of education, have paid lots for university degrees that are not then offering them the kind of employment they expected they would. And we're seeing, large numbers of young workers, taking industrial action, joining unions, starting unions in sectors for the first time, because they don't see a future in the kinds of employment that maybe generations before them had seen. The promise of security, the promise of being able to own their own home, to be able to afford to have a family, the kinds of things that previous generations might have expected, many people are not being able to access. And I think we're only likely to see those waves of industrial action continue as people's living standards decline. I think maybe the other speakers could confirm this, but at least in Britain, the generation of my age and below is the first generation who will do worse than the generation that came before them. And that's an important tipping point in many ways, to see declining job standards, employment standards, these sorts of things. And I think they pose big questions for us about, the future of work.
Yeah. You remind me in the story of the young man who there's a museum in one of the old mill towns in Massachusetts that displays the lives of the mill girls, as they were called then, who in the 19th century came from the farms to work in early industrial factories. And it shows their living conditions, but plays also the caloric food that were required to keep them able to stand at the looms for something that was a 60-hour workday, and to keep them from sort of collapsing under the burden of that kind of labor. And it's interesting just to listen to that anecdote and to think about the kinds of cycles of labor and actually the bodily impact on that. And it's interesting also to listen to what you're describing, someone who's positioned in the United States, who spends a great deal of his time in Europe, to think about then the variations that someone like Stefan is dealing with, that the difference between the United States, where I would say that healthcare might be one of the primary concerns. Education costs are similar with the UK and with the United States. But in continental Europe, in the EU, those are perhaps differently formulated. At the same time, Jamie, one of the things I might observe, and is perhaps a hole in our conversation today, is that indeed many of our Eastern European colleagues would say, oh, we already went through that, and we never overcame that loss of standard of living. And we're still trying to get back there. And Stefan, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering, there's been a number of questions raised here, and I think going back to you, it might be also Jamie's in effect pointing to this question of the neoliberal underpinnings or the presumed neoliberal underpinnings of the current EU project. I think in earlier iterations, we can go back and see it much more aligned with the social welfare state, but kinds of transformations, correct me, or especially someone who's operating also in a realm that's not just employment, but about questions of equity and fairness and workplace issues. If you might have some response to what we've been hearing.
Sure, and very interesting so far. Yeah, I think to me, our response to these sets of crises that we've had, the pandemic, the Russian aggression, as opposed to the response that the EU had to the 2008 crisis, is of course completely different. And I would say that we learned a tremendous amount from the response to the 2008 and Euro crisis and the austerity, and here with an unprecedented number of new tools. The short-term work schemes, for example, which really preserved the European workforce and kept it in jobs, as opposed to the US model, was really unprecedented, and the bonds. And so there, if you look at it from a policy perspective, I would say that this Commission and this EU, because of this was of course approved by the Parliament and Council, has acted very differently, and so that's one aspect. Another aspect is, I would say, on the more labor law side, and here, well, Jamie will know it by heart, our proposal on the platform protection of the platform workers, which I'm personally part of the negotiation team on that now, and it's no proposal is perfect, but I find it both in terms of the presumption, the AI, the data protection part, it's quite far-reaching. And if you compare to the rest of the world, this I think is cutting edge. So and we also had another one. Yeah, please.
But that's great. Describe in more detail what that looks like. I think Jamie might know it by heart, but I think many of our audience might not, and indeed, it certainly is the case that the EU has been at the forefront of responding to and very much setting standards within certain areas, like the digital transformation and social media, and here the platform economy. So maybe you could run a few more laps with describing that in some better detail for us, so that we understand what the initiative is.
Yeah, I think there are two key proposals when it comes to responding to this labor market that Jamie described, and that Jane also took up. And I mean, one was what is not a very sexy title, but the transparent and predictable working conditions, which came in making clear that the 0-hour contract and on-call kind of non-civil law contract, so no real contract, you get called at any time, if you don't come you get fired, that this is not acceptable, and there needs to be a clear contract. It can't be a 0-hour contract. You can't fire somebody just because they don't come on a whim, but you need some basic conditions of employment, in addition to working time regulation and all of that we have already. And all of these has to be clear in the contract. So that was an important piece of legislation. And then we did a year ago or a year and a half ago, we presented a specific proposal for a legislation protecting platform workers, which basically, I mean, Jamie will, because it's quite complex, but basically there is a kind of a presumption with a number of criteria, so that if your work is decided by the employer, if you have very little, you're not a dentist, you're not deciding your own time, your own clients, but all of this is then you're presumed to be a worker. And then all that means that all the protection applies, that you have working time, health and safety, etc. And then there are some additional provisions here as well in terms of your insight in how the algorithm can decide your work or fire you, and there are some limits to this as well, and some other provisions. And this is now being negotiated between the ministers of the member states and the parliamentarians in the European Parliament. And the Spanish presidency of the EU is hoping to get a deal before the end of the year. So this is trying to keep the platform. It's not trying to kill the platform model, no. It's trying just to say that, listen, if you really are a worker in the sense that we see it, then you should also have working conditions, social protection, because you don't have the independence that a self-employed has, and the economic freedom and often space to have your own social protection and manage your own time. So it's a very interesting proposal, and I'm quite confident that we will have a deal at least within 6 months. So yeah.
Very interesting. It raises for me some. You remind me. So this question of a kind of predictability and transparency. That in our conversation, we're hearing both a desire for flexibility and yet a desire for stability. The problems of kind of coherency and a path forward in one's professional or career development. Economic growth in one's pockets, as it were, to be able to meet costs and spend time with family. Those are all things that are involved here that aren't necessarily just platform questions. And I know that in Spain there was a recent initiative to provide a consistency for workers in the tourist sector, who then will have a kind of ability to return contractually to the same place that they were working in seasonal labor, knowing that in the spring, summer, fall months, when the resort is open, they will be able to go back to the same place, and a kind of investment in the individual in a relationship. But there's also the question of a kind of a discussion of remanufacturing and bringing back manufacturing to Europe, to the United States as well, which presumes not necessarily old industrial forms, but something of new forms. And finally, one of the things that I'm hearing out of the conversation, but hasn't been overly stressed, is indeed the role of labor unions here. Because Stefan, what you're describing, actually, it strikes me as interesting that the EU is almost acting on behalf of the worker in the capacity that a labor union might have been acting in the past, but we're talking about workers who are often not unionized and whose rights and ability to protect themselves is often itself part of the precarity of that working condition. Does anyone want to pick up one of those themes or respond to those observations? I know that each of you have different kinds of investments in that. Or maybe Jane, you're actively nodding here, and so maybe I can put you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you had held this webinar in maybe a decade ago or a decade and a half ago, there was a sort of a maybe not exactly a consensus, but a labor unions were viewed as very much a kind of a double-edged sword in some regards in a lot of the European political economy literature, because on the one hand, it seemed as though they were relatively successful at protecting their members. But on the other hand, the sort of frame at that time was, well, there's this whole group of so-called outsiders outside of the realm of the protection of these unions, and in fact these, the unions are playing a role at sort of hoarding the good jobs for these insiders. I don't think that way of thinking about things is as prevalent anymore. I mean, I think we've seen in the last decade the centrality of labor unions in a whole variety of different formats, including coalitions across types of unions. And so although the kind of lead industrial unions remain very important, public sector unions, service sector unions, especially that are mobilizing a lot of women or low paid workers, often ethnic minorities who were traditionally excluded from aspects of kind of male industrial unions, have been playing an increasingly important role. And as a result, there's a lot of interest in sort of how do we think about legislation that would expand the rights of unions, that give them a bigger role, that support collective forms of organization. But it is incredibly challenging for some sectors of the economy, in part because employers in those sectors see very little value to working with unions, and the task of organizing workers in those sectors is particularly challenging. And so then because people move around a lot, they don't have a lot of flexibility, they may have less time or scope, and they may just face real, maybe not as much in many European contexts as in the US, where they might fear some kind of a reprisal or really just face difficulties organizing, but nonetheless, there can still be problems. And so sort of where you haven't inherited large unions, as you sort of still have in many parts of Northern Europe, where you have still fairly extensive organizing role for unions, and certainly a very extensive extension of collective bargaining coverage to many different workers, you're in a much more difficult position. And then the question becomes sort of what role the state can play, either in facilitating more labor union penetration, and whether that's even politically feasible in some political climates, or whether sort of public policies of the type that you point to become a substitute for that. I think, and this is just my own kind of 2 cents on this, is that the role of policies will never fully substitute for what sort of more collective forms of organization amongst labor accomplish. And so policies become really important in contexts that lack them, but they're not a substitute for really worker organization and what that does to kind of push the direction of an economy. And so those two things really need to work together if you want to create a more labor-oriented political economy.
Interesting. I want to send out a reminder to the audience, the attendees, that please at any time use the chat function to pose questions to our panelists directly, I'll bring them into the conversation. But you remind me, Jane, that there was an incident, I believe it was in Alabama, where a Volkswagen factory was to be opened, and the Volkswagen factory wanted, in effect, union representation at its factory and a right to work state. And the locals were like, no, we don't unionize here, and yet kind of employer-employee relationship is very much a structure of the German economy and the way that the German factory is set up, and here it's in a very different kind of environment. And I think that's one of the things about the sort of transnationalization of economies that go beyond just the boundary of the Schengen zone out into the world, and something of the EU impact. So apparently in Alabama, there's a Volkswagen factory with union representation by virtue of the factory owners wanting it to be working with the union, and that's a very different kind of dynamic. But it also speaks.
Yeah, just a very short point, which is quite interesting. When the economy changes, as policymakers, we have to be careful to see that we see how this develops. And we had one very interesting element in the platform context, which was that one of the excuses for some of the platforms not to accept representatives of the platform workers was that it could be seen as a cartel in competition terms. So we came in then and clarified that for if vulnerable workers come together, that would not be seen as a cartel, and therefore platform workers can conclude an agreement with the platform, and this would not be seen as a cartel, as opposed to, I have nothing against dentists, but I think they're the perfect self-employed, as opposed to a number of dentists concluding an agreement on prices. That would be very different from platform workers who would conclude a collective agreement with the platform, or self-employed, vulnerable self-employed concluding. So here we also see that there is this need of adapting and facilitating, like Jane said, the collective bargaining. And I fully agree that we cannot, by legislation, and should not try to substitute, but just set a minimum level. And then what we also try to put in is the possibility for trade unions and employers to deviate to a certain extent and improve the conditions in these minimum conditions. So because, again, I think our view is that if we're going to move in the green transition, for example, and do those hard changes in the economy, we got to have the social partners, employers and trade unions on board for those changes. So that has to work.
Someone just pointed out today that electric vehicles require far fewer parts. And that's something that is going to impact the extended auto industry throughout Europe in brand new ways. And it feels to me that one of the challenges and burdens, but perhaps excitement of being a politician, being in a social policy making position, is to both be active and reactive, right? To try and shape things forward. I was warned about a minute ago that we only have 4 minutes left, which is making me feel breathless at this moment because I have so many things I want to ask you all. But Jamie, I want to turn this over to you for a moment, because you've really also been thinking about, in this term workerism, to think about the way that the structures of the new forms of economy are also allowing for new forms of organization, of labor organization. And so in this conversation about the needs of the worker and the self-representation of labor, and it really is bound up in I would say certain kinds of concerns that we have about social democracy and union busting that might be coming from the right, and the anticipation that there's going to be pressure there. Jamie, I'm wondering if you might have, I don't want to give you the last word here, but at least some important words on the matter.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of quick things. The first is about employment status, and I think I don't understand the dentist example because my dentist is employed by the NHS. So I think this is a cross-cultural difference, but I know exactly what you mean, Stefan. I do think one of the things we need to think about is, an assumption that if people are employed by somebody else, they are not self-employed, and they therefore have the right to organize. And I think, the UK has this horrible award of being the place that initiated outsourcing, that spends so much of its government money on outsourcing, that shifts the burden away from employers onto other organizations and onto individual workers. And I think it is a scam, and it needs to be stopped, because this is no fair way to engage people. I think the other point very quickly that I would make is, I think we're seeing a return of unions in some ways, but I think what we're also seeing is a return of workers organizing. And I think these are two different phenomena that often overlap. And I think what we've seen in Britain in particular, and in some parts of Europe, is many employers and the state in some contexts just refusing to negotiate with unions, refusing to talk about above inflation pay rises, refusing to talk about terms and conditions. And so from below, many unions have been forced to take action who never have in recent history, or sometimes even in their entire history. The Royal College of Nursing in Britain has organized its first strike, for example. And I think it's a mistake to only think about what's happening with unions. I think it's actually at the base that things are changing, like with Starbucks workers in the US or Amazon workers in the US. I think that's incredibly exciting because I think there might be new forms of representation, new ways of organizing unions that unions can learn from in that moment.
New form of union as such. I'm sorry. Ingrid just pointed out that she actually miscalculated the time, and we have a little bit more. So we don't need to be breathless. We can extend the conversation. But so the nature of organizing is important here. The ability to formulate a representation for oneself collectively. I would just say that here at this university, the faculty just organized. We formed a union, which was a real transformation. So feeling that kind of experience. But Stefan, I'm wondering if you might have some reply to what Jamie was suggesting, as in effect, it seems to me that part of the initiative here, transparent and predictable, for instance, is really to kind of capture some of that dynamic, some of the different kinds of working structures that we're looking at.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we have another interesting, and it's late in our session, but I just want to bring in another very interesting development we have, which is that under EU law, the social partners, so the European Trade Union Confederation and the employers can negotiate working conditions at EU level and ask then that these become law. And they're doing so now in the area of telework and the very important issue of the right to disconnect. And they've been negotiating this now for, I think, 9 months, and they're coming towards the end. We don't know if they're going to come up with an agreement. We hope very much they will, because it would be the first one in a decade, and actually the first new one really since the mid-90s. And that would again show this strength that there is of being so close to the issue that these actors are, as opposed to with all we academics, policymakers, in terms of that really understanding how does it work on the work floor and how do you set up something like the right to disconnect. So that's a very interesting initiative, but I really don't know. We really don't know because we're not party to these negotiations if it's going to work or not. But I think that's really another one to follow. That's the more classic trade union employer, but it could give an important signal of the power of this dialogue if it works. So yeah, another one to follow.
One of the terms, so unions, and if one of you wants to continue with the question of unions, I'm happy to pursue it further. But I'm also, one of the terms that is in the background that I'd like to bring to the fore for a moment at least is the question of immigration, migration. So Europe without borders allows for a certain kind of internal movement, and it certainly means that parts of Eastern Europe and the new Balkan states are kind of emptying out in a search for more profitable labor in other economies. Nursing is one of the things that's heavily impacted, but I'm wondering here, and I'm wondering here then about people coming in from outside of then in effect the Schengen zone or from outside of the EU, and one of the conversations has been in here Stefan raised we've been talking about skills versus credentials. So often people who are crossing borders are not bringing either the same kinds of credentials that creates a problem with entering into the workforce, especially if you are undocumented and you're entering into the space. There's massive need for laborers. There's discussions, in effect, that something like the Ukrainian talent pool created an ease of the movement of credentials that hasn't been given over to other people. And people who are within asylum status in the EU are not being given the same kind of access to labor as based on the kind of credentialing, even though they're bringing other credentials, or they're definitely bringing skills with them. And I'm wondering then if we could just talk a little bit about the impact of or the need for migration, the need for new workers. You've all, in effect, pointed to that the workforce is that there are a lot of holes in the workforce that need to be filled. I think, Jane, you pointed out that really it's the impediment to a lot of employers to just have people working and finding possible employees. Would one of you be interested in picking that theme up for a moment with us? I'll happily call on someone. Jane, maybe?
I can say a few things. Yeah, and so I'm not an expert on immigration at all, but I mean, I think there's sort of three interlinked issues. So the first is the way immigration has been politicized. And the politics of immigration have been really central to populist appeals. Mainstream right and left parties have also picked up aspects of these. And in some ways, that has instigated public discussions in many countries about sort of not just the level of migration, but the sort of boundaries of social solidarity in welfare states that is potentially corrosive of some forms of institutions, and certainly mobilizes voters in some cases in ways that maybe are not well, I mean, people can vote how they want, but it's mobilizing voters in ways that don't necessarily reproduce social benefits that might be sort of broadly beneficial. So I think immigration as an issue, that the sort of supply side of politics, the way that it's been picked up, mobilized, discussed, has certainly shaped many of these discussions, and often in ways that haven't necessarily been productive for social policies and labor. The second thing is then, okay, so in what ways then how do we think about immigration within the context of European labor markets? And I think, again, there's sort of a second two sets of issues, which is sort of how labor is incorporated and the ways in which immigrants themselves, the ways in which immigrants are incorporated into labor markets, and the ways in which then they're treated. And certainly in some sectors in some countries, immigrants are doing a lot of the jobs that are in very low paid and quite exploitative sectors. And so if you look at the care sector, personal care is like people who work in homes looking after the elderly. Many of these, in many countries, it's a disproportionately female migrant labor force. Often these are some of the hardest workers to mobilize because they're working in someone else's homes. They are very vulnerable to exploitation and low wages. And even if they're legal migrants in the sense that they're coming from within the EU, they often have very little ability to exit poor employment relationships. And so in some of these sectors, there really needs to be a lot of thought put into the ways in which to give migrants better opportunities in labor markets. From the side of the kind of existing domestic workers, there's a sort of a long-standing question about sort of what immigration does to wages. Most of the economic evidence suggests that it doesn't exert a lot of downward pressure on wages, that you can sort of bring immigrants in and it doesn't necessarily cause problems in terms of the position of domestic workers. But there are cases in which, and going back to the very first conversation that we had about skills, that in which sort of high-skilled visas and other forms of recruiting of migrants from abroad can be a substitute for employers investing in some of their own workers. And the question is sort of how you create labor regimes in which immigrants have a set of social rights that permits them to be in non-exploitative employment relationships, but also maintains, I think, the structure of organization and so on for other workers in the economy. And that's been a tricky balancing act. And then there's a fourth issue, which is that, populations in Europe, especially in some countries, are really growing at very slow paces. Fertility rates are very low. We're going to see migration as an issue that continues to be important in the future, and there's going to be persistent labor shortages in the future. And so dealing with sort of some of these issues around the incorporation of migrants, their organization, and making sure that they have access to social benefits is a really important issue, and it's one that's hard to do in the current political environment where there's been a lot of politicization of migration in ways that I think undercut some of those discussions.
Mm-hmm. That's historically also a divide between the nation states and the European level. And so the EU is often the punching boy for the policies, even as it's clear that labor migration is necessary to offset the deficits, as it were, that are existing in those environments. Stefan, do you have any thoughts about the way that that's best negotiated?
Yeah, no, I agree with very much that Jane said. I mean, we still have an youth unemployment, or 14 or 15% of youth still not in education, employment, etc. So it's important that we don't use labor migration or immigration as an excuse not to try to reach out to those that are a bit harder to reach. And I think that's part of the skills job of trying to reach out to and find more innovative ways of bringing people in and skilling people, and not maybe having all of these formal and systems. So that's one part. We see, of course, that there are a number of, I mean, all member states in the EU and a lot of countries, a lot of developed countries are trying to attract skilled labor. They're investing quite a lot of money in this, but they're not very successful in it. I mean, the cost of bringing in people is quite high, actually. I think we spoke to some German colleagues who, I think the cost was 10,000 euros a person to get somebody in and then start skilling. I mean, so start training, and so it's really we lack, I think, the systems. We're trying at EU level, and we're coming with an initiative this autumn called the talent pool, where we try to create a system which member states can join, where we would have a possibility for people from, for example, Northern Africa who want to come to Europe to register their education and willingness and to match this with employers, and also to have then a kind of a control on these employers that these are serious employers and not somebody who wants to exploit people. So we're trying to set this up. It's not easy. And again, this will be a proposal, and we know, as was said, that in many member states this has become a political issue. The country I know best, which Sweden, where there are big battery factories being built, and there's simply not the people to do it. At the same time, I think there's a debate about immigration that's going in another direction. So there is clearly a big divide here between European competitiveness and green transition and digital transition and this. So it's a very interesting area, and it's going a bit in all directions. I think, to sum up, today, possibly what we see is that the companies themselves are doing this better than the state. And often, I mean, these big companies are quite good at it, and they're serious and they invest. So those are not villains here, but there are obviously also other areas which is really shameful. So yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Jamie, do you want to contribute to that? I mean, I think your book on employment is really also investigating these kinds of dynamics, and so migration, and we now actually heard gender and age, that is to say youth, are often very much impacted here. I didn't know the 14%, but that's an interesting statistic of youth unemployment, and probably higher in various parts of Europe than in other parts, but still in a moment where there is need and opportunity to see that kind of unemployment, whereas then a quest for a certain kind of flexible life that's not necessarily in a relationship. So part of what we're also talking about is the ability of employers to invest in their employees and to do that with finances and resources that in a disruptive economy, those employers may not be there in 3-4 years, and so to devote that kind of energy is also a question. And again, I raised so many things, Jamie. I'm not exactly sure. You don't need to respond directly to me, but I'm really being provoked with ideas by the conversation here, and appreciate the what's being opened up. Yeah,
I have a couple of comments, if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Jane is absolutely right to talk about the social care crisis that's approaching. And in Britain, there's now a series of new visa schemes that are being opened up, particularly Zimbabwe and other countries, to bring in large numbers of migrant workers to do this kind of work, whilst at the same time trying to make it much harder for migrants from other parts of the world, or who don't have what are considered to be the necessary skills to work in care. So I think it's very uneven, the approach to migration. For example, the agricultural sector in Britain is struggling to recruit because the conditions are very difficult. The pay is very, very low and often involve large-scale wage theft. So people don't want to come and work in agriculture in the same way. But there's a series of infrastructural crises in Britain, which I'm sure some of these are replicated across the Eurozone. For example, 500,000 houses a year would need to be retrofitted in Britain to bring them up to standard around environmentalism. I imagine at present it's probably something like 1,000 are being done a year, or some unbelievably low figure. The infrastructure is broadly crumbling in Britain, whether it's the road network, the rail network, the water, electricity networks. There are huge infrastructural projects that need to be undertaken, and there's lots of work that could be generated. In Britain, one of the reasons why there are so many people who are migrating is because of the actions historically of Britain across the world. So the idea of then preventing the flow of labor is an incredibly cruel continuation of those relationships. So I think when we think about the future of work, there are a number of settlements we can think about as part of that future of work. But one of the things that I always say this to my students: we shouldn't talk about the future of work in the abstract. We should talk about the choices people are making right now, and whether that is going to make work better or worse. And unfortunately, we're surrounded by choices that are leading us down the path to more dystopian futures. And so I think we really have to champion anything that is trying to do something different, right?
What does that mean concretely? Say something more about that.
Well, I do think some of the initiatives that Stefan has been talking about, actually resolving issues around employment status, I really hope this goes through, Stefan. I think this would be a big change. I think every time there is a new union deal or a recognition agreement or some new conditions, I think each of these point to a fairer and more democratic future of work. But I think, on the flip side, you talk about the spread of union busting techniques from the US into Britain and Europe. there are plenty of things pointing in the other direction, aren't there?
Yes. Yeah. And it's certainly it's ironic in many ways from people who are observing the process in post-Brexit UK with the restriction or the aggression towards, say, especially the image of the Polish plumber, and now desperately needing labor and not looking to the immediate neighbors, but having to go quite far afield. And much of this is also, participating in kind of brain drain, labor drain elsewhere, and within the EU itself, there are certainly states that are having difficulties, especially in the east and south, to keep their own services intact, precisely because people are moving elsewhere. So, yeah. And I was trying to think of how we can get back to the more. I'm not trying to be Pollyannish here, but it does seem that it's in our best interest to try and underscore what's working at times, especially as we face climate crises and transformations that are often overwhelming to the electorate. And I think that that's part of why an anti-immigrant and anti-migrant discourse that is so opposed to the actual interests of the states themselves, of the people in those states, is so confusing to us, because it appeals to people who are feeling themselves to be overwhelmed by the world that they inhabit and the transformations there, and so keep things closed down is often one of the easiest responses. But Stefan, I'm wondering if we could go back to the question then of skills, because, or Jane, it feels to me that one of the questions here in economies that are transforming, if employers are not necessarily the stable industrial formations that they used to be in the 20th century, it seems then in our conversation that the state, the European level, has to step in to provide that kind of training, and that's where then academia, the educational aspect, plays a role, and skills are, as Jamie was just saying, we need in confrontation with climate change, we need a lot of retrofitting, we need a lot of transformation of our infrastructure, and it's a kind of level of labor that people can move into with a bit of proper training, and then space opens up for them. I'm wondering if you might have an ability to analyze the possibilities of providing those skills. Both Jane, you particularly sort of underscored that's at a cost to the employer. It is obviously then, Stefan, at a cost to the EU as such. How is it possible to unleash those resources to make sure that the skills that we need for the future are being developed, whether it's at the level of the employer or whether it's at the level of a kind of overarching state or European level training project? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Maybe Jane first.
Okay, I'll say a few things, but then I'm very interested to hear. So look, I think that there's a couple of issues here. So I think that the state probably does need to play a pretty active role in providing skills, and not to say that the sort of more traditional employer-led training in some cases won't persist, but it's just that there's a broader range of jobs that are maybe going to be harder to build those kind of partnerships in, and in where sort of some degree of state leadership is going to be absolutely central. We know that certain kinds of educational institutions in the long run can have really positive effects on both the individuals and places, and those don't have to be universities or vocational training institutions. Often something like a community college in the US, that these can have really positive local spillovers in both allowing people at different stages in their life to gain skills and also providing much more sort of locally oriented skills. I think what we're less good at, at least coming from the academic side, is figuring out how to really build those institutions in ways that persist in the long run. So often the positive effects of these institutions on local communities and so on don't emerge very quickly. And one of the problems I think we've had in the UK, at least, is that there's often these attempts to sort of reform different non-university level qualifications or to increase employers' incentives to do training. They don't really work. They're sort of backpedaled, and you don't get a sort of a consistent investment in those kinds of skills. And so thinking about how to kind of create a credible commitment on the part of the state to sort of investing in maybe non-university forms of skills that are more flexible, quicker for people to gain, and that also that people could potentially access at later points in their life. So, if you think about giving people more career mobility over the lifetime is probably going to be, we're not sure exactly how technology is going to change things, but I would anticipate that the sort of lifespan of any skills you gain in the early adult years is going to become lower. Like that lifetime is going to shrink over time, and people will need to continue to train over the life cycle. But getting sort of buy-in for that from employers and from the state to give people those opportunities has proven to be very difficult. Out of a small number of Northern European countries like Denmark, where you have these kind of lifetime training programs that are successful, outside of those contexts, they've been very difficult to sort of vest. And I think that the sort of political challenge is to think about how you create institutions or incentives at the firm level that do create more capacity for people to do that. And should those run through firms, or should we think about other forms of benefits that the state could give people, like lifetime training credits, more access to low-cost courses that you could take over the life cycle that would allow that. And I think creative thinking in that area will be really central to building up some of these institutions.
Yeah, on my part, just to first briefly on these big funds that were created and unleashed after the pandemic, and we have something like 30 billion euros that goes straight to upskilling that the member state draw from European funds. I mean, these are of course money that comes from the member states, and then we administer them and they go back. But 30 billion into skills. So that's one positive. Another important, I think, moment we are right now with this very low unemployment is that we see also that employers are making another effort in training themselves and also recruiting people who they might not have recruited. They might change their criteria and be more open and not always recruit people who look like themselves, or and therefore they also might need to, or they're aware that they would need to add some language training or digital training, but they're simply so desperate that they do it, which comes back to the points that Jamie and Jane have made, in that we need this employer responsibility and that will in turn also create, I think, a solidarity with the company that will be productive and create a loyalty as well. So I think this pays off. But as we know, today's economy is often very short-term based in terms of short-term profit. So to do these bigger investments demands, either a bit of desperation or some real vision. So those are positive developments. We also see, and coming back to the to collective agreements, and yes, we're back to the north, of course, but we see in Sweden, for example, the social partners have concluded an agreement where the state also pitches in money, but where if you worked a number of years, I think it's 10 years, you can take a year off, study whatever you want, at I can't remember 70% pay, so this is this and the cost is then shared by the social partners and the state. So that type of and that's what you need, no, in terms of if you're going to do these transitions in the economy. So it's going to be. I think everybody needs to pitch in. And I'll end with that. I think there's a danger in this idea that we can try to predict which skills, what skills do we really need. We're trying. No, we have this agency in Thessaloniki, Sedefop, that we do beautiful, and they do a great job. But in the end, you got to go along and just keep training and keep developing, and not try to pin down exactly what is needed. And until you've done that, you don't start. No. And that's why I like this Swedish collective agreement, which means that people decide themselves what they would like to learn, and if they would like to change, and it's not decided that they have to train on the thing that the employer wants them to train on, but they can choose themselves. And I think that can be a very interesting model to follow.
I think one of the things that, we're coming to an end, but I would say that, the old Marxist understanding that labor is part of identity and of the development of human capacity, not simply to be working for other people, but labor is a situation which one is working on oneself, is perhaps indeed an ideal that we are all underscoring here. Stefan, I don't want to necessarily put you in the Marxist camp, but to at least understand that understanding of labor as being something that should lead to the fulfillment of the person as such, is something that's resoundingly at the heart of everybody here in our circle. I'm now 3 minutes over time, and so I'm just going to thank the three of you for a very rich and wonderful conversation, and I really appreciated your time and your commitment to the work that you're all doing. And with that, have a good evening where you are, and be well. Yes, thank you.